they named me Noor Callahan. Noor, meaning light. My mother once told me she didn't choose that name because I was born at sunrise, but because she feared I'd grow up in darkness. And she was right. Not the kind of darkness that comes with nightfall, but the kind that wraps itself in applause, framed diplomas, and glass trophies, none of which ever had my name. In the Callahan family, achievement was a currency. Ethan, my older cousin, was minted in gold. He'd barely scratched the surface of anything real, but his, every breath seemed to sparkle. On a roll, at age 10, interned for a senator, by 17, accepted into the Ivy League before the ink dried on his high school diploma. The family's golden boy. His face was on Christmas cards. Mine wasn't even on the fridge. When I joined the military at 19, my father called it an emotional reaction. My mother, holding back tears, said quietly, "Just don't embarrass us. No party, no farewell, no family dinner before I left." The same year, Ethan got a standing ovation at his scholarship ceremony. I packed my bags and left in silence. Emery, my younger cousin, the only one who ever really looked at me like I mattered, slipped me a folded note in the driveway. "Write if you can," it said. "I'll listen, even if no one else does." I hadn't set foot on the Callahan property in nearly 10 years, but then came the invitation, handwritten, wax seal formal. My father's 60th birthday. Family, only it read. Formal attire. Presents requested, not optional. I almost tossed it. Almost. But something about its weight, the arrogance, the unspoken assumption that I'd forgotten everything they never gave me made me book the flight. I arrived in Missouri under a pale sky clouds low and heavy like the weight in my chest. The family estate hadn't changed, wide white columns, brick path too clean to be real, and hedges trimmed to military precision. It was the kind of place that photographed well and lived poorly. Inside, the air smelled like polish and quiet resentment. The party had already begun when I stepped in. Ethan was at the centre, laughing in a navy suit, his West Point pin catching the light. A projection screen played a slideshow of his accomplishments, news interviews, press releases, and awards. Not one mention of my deployments. Not one image of the 2 years I spent in sandstorms and silence-building operations that would never be declassified. The music swelled as my father entered. Everyone stood. Toasts began. To the man who taught us what excellence looks like, someone said. To legacy, another added. My mother stood beside him, her smile-tight eyes darting toward me just once. Then the speech began. Ethan stepped up to the mic. "Dad," he said, voice smooth, every word rehearsed. "I want to thank you for never accepting anything less than greatness, for reminding us that the world doesn't remember the quiet ones, it remembers the leaders." A pause. He looked directly at me. Not everyone in this family took that lesson to heart, but I did. And I owe it all to you. The crowd clapped. My mother wiped a tear. Emery from across the room looked down at his drink. I stood near the back, invisible, just like they liked me. My heart didn't race. It went still. I had expected exclusion. I hadn't expected mockery disguised as honour. But then, in the middle of Ethan's next sentence, the screen behind him blinked. It wasn't supposed to. The slideshow froze. The AV guy in the corner stood up confused. And then it changed. A breaking news alert. Red banner. White text. Presidential Medal of Strategic Valor awarded to youngest female commander in US military history. The room stilled. The name appeared: Commander Noor Callahan, classified strategist and silent architect of Operation Winterlight. A still image followed. Me, not smiling, in uniform, hair tied back, campaign ribbons heavy across my chest. The medal was pinned near my heart. The news anchor's voice cut through the room. In a rare declassification, the Department of Defense has confirmed that Callahan's leadership directly prevented a national crisis through cyber defense warfare and human extraction missions kept under wraps for over 7 years. Sources confirm she was instrumental in halting what would have been the largest loss of American civilian life on foreign soil since 2001. No one moved. Forks froze. Ethan's mouth hung open. My father's hands shook. The champagne glass tipped and shattered. My mother clutched the edge of the table. Emery's eyes widened, not with shock, but something deeper. Something like justice. I stood in silence. Didn't smile, didn't cry, just breathed. For once, I wasn't outside the frame. I was the frame. They hadn't clapped when I left. They hadn't called when I disappeared. They hadn't believed in silence. But silence, I'd learned, doesn't mean weakness. It means restraint. And when truth finally speaks, it doesn't shout. It echoes. It echoes. That echo started long before the news report, long before the medal. It started the day my mother whispered, "You'll grow up in the dark north, so I'm giving you a name that means light." She didn't say it like a blessing. She said it like a warning. Not in fear of failure, but in anticipation of invisibility. Our family loved winners, but not the kind who scraped through storms, only the ones who looked good in photos. Our walls were crowded with plaques, trophies, and a literal timeline of Callahan's accomplishments. And in that museum of merit, I was the missing exhibit. My kindergarten drawing of a tree had once been framed beside Ethan's Young Innovator ribbon, but when guests came, mine would mysteriously go missing, replaced by another of Ethan's certificates. I stopped looking for it after a while. It was like trying to trace a shadow in a sun-drenched room. By 12, Ethan had his own shelf. By 14, his own section of the family album. I didn't even have a page. My certificates from junior ROTC buried in a kitchen drawer, beneath takeout menus and old batteries. I remember the day I made squad leader. I came home still in uniform, cheeks flushed with the kind of pride that burns quietly. We had a drill, I told my father, and I led. He barely looked up. That's nice. Make sure the dog's been fed? My mother gave a tight smile, then turned to compliment Ethan's science fair model. My light wasn't unseen. It was ignored. There was this photo, once one I loved. I age 11 in camo face paint from a weekend camp, holding a compass and smiling like I'd found my place in the world. I put it in a silver frame and set it on the living room shelf beside the family photos. A week later, it was gone. Replaced by a picture of Ethan in a blazer shaking hands with a visiting congressman. I asked my mother about it. She said gently, "It didn't match the colour scheme." I didn't cry. I wasn't wired that way. But that night, I took the photo and hid it in the back of my closet behind winter coats and broken hangers. Every now and then, I'd take it out. Just to remind myself I'd been real once, that joy had lived somewhere in my face. Emery was the only one who noticed. He was younger than I by 3 years, always watching, always quiet. When I came home from training at 17, with a certificate stamped in bold letters top percentile in tactical readiness, I laid it gently on the kitchen table. Ethan walked in 2 minutes later waving a letter. "I made it into the Future Leaders Club," he said. The room erupted like someone had won a lottery. No one even saw the paper I'd left behind. Emery did. That night, they slipped it back into my room, folded neatly with a note. "This matters too." I think that's when I realised Emery wasn't just watching. He was learning what not to say. How to survive in a family that filters value through volume and visibility. He lived beneath their radar like I did, only quieter. Sometimes he'd text me questions about my deployments. "Is it scary? Do you miss home? Do they treat you better out there?" I'd always respond even from base, never give long answers, just enough to let him know I was still here. The rest of them, they didn't ask. Not when I left, not when I got promoted, not when I disappeared from public records because my clearance level got sealed. Not when I stopped sending postcards, because no one ever replied. They didn't erase me violently. They did it in soft, practiced ways, smiling, while replacing my name with Ethan's, clapping, while pushing me behind the curtain, complimenting my bravery, while never once asking what it cost me. And maybe the cruelest part was that they believed their love was equal. They believed they were fair. That's what makes a certain kind of darkness so hard to name. It's not a shout. It's a silence dressed up in affection. So, yes, when the screen blinked and the room fell still, and my name rang out across a celebration meant to erase me, something inside me didn't bloom. It surfaced. It had always been there, waiting. 9 years is a long time not to be missed. Longer still when the people you left behind never even noticed you were gone. But when the invitation came, elegant, cardstock, wax-sealed, like some royal decree, I opened it slowly, like something might leap out and bite me. It read, "Join us in celebrating Robert Callahan's 60th birthday. Family only. Formal attire. Presents requested, not optional." I stared at the word family like it might fall apart under scrutiny. My first instinct was to toss it. My second was to burn it. But my third said, go. They didn't ask about me for almost a decade. Didn't send flowers when I was hospitalized overseas. Didn't write when my unit went dark for months during a covert assignment. Yet now, after all this time, I was requested. The cynic in me smirked. This wasn't about my father. It was about Ethan. It was always about Ethan. He'd probably won another award, landed some political position, or gotten engaged to someone whose last name looked good in print. The birthday was just the stage. Ethan would be in the spotlight. So, I went. I wore no uniform, no badges, just a plain black dress, low heels hair in a knot. Invisible, but intentional. There was a certain power in being unrecognized, like walking into an enemy camp unnoticed. Missouri hadn't changed. The fields still rolled out flat and endless, the sky stretching wide like it was trying to escape. The Callahan estate stood proud at the edge of town, its white pillars glowing in the late afternoon light, pristine and cold like a wedding cake no one dared to slice. I stepped through the front door and was met with polished smiles, clinking glasses, and the heavy scent of money performing modesty. The room swirled with laughter, thinly veiled judgment, and the sound of Ethan's name dropping like confetti from everyone's mouths. I moved quietly along the edges past portraits that had been updated. There he was, Ethan on a yacht. Ethan giving a commencement speech. Ethan shaking hands with someone vaguely powerful. No trace of me, not even the childhood ones. I hovered near the edge of the buffet unnoticed. A woman I didn't recognize leaned toward another and whispered, "Is that one of the caterers?" My aunt walked by, gave me a tight smile, then turned to greet someone else mid-step. My father didn't even look in my direction when I passed by. I wasn't just invisible, I was erased. Then I saw him, Emery. He stood alone near the hallway, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched like he was trying to take up less space than he already did. Emery had always been different. Sensitive, quiet, a reader, the kind of kid who got called soft by the uncles and told to man up by his dad, the only one who ever wrote me back. His eyes caught mine, widened for a second, and then softened. He walked over like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to. Then, in a voice barely above the music, he said, "You're really here." I smiled. "Looks that way." He paused. "You look strong." I tilted my head. "That's supposed to mean I didn't before." He laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "No. I mean, you've always been that. Just now they might actually notice." I glanced around the room. "Doubt it. They're still clapping for the wrong people." He looked down. "You still keep in touch with anyone?" I shook my head. Just you. That hit him. His eyes got glassy, but he blinked it away. You. Doing okay, he whispered. His Vietnamese was shaky but deliberate. It was something we'd shared quietly, language, as a way of reclaiming the parts the family ignored. I nodded once. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since I walked in. We stood there a moment longer, two shadows in a house that only celebrated reflections. Then the music changed. A microphone clicked on. A voice rang out, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to honour the man who built this family, Robert Callahan. And stay tuned, because our own Ethan has something very special to announce tonight." The crowd erupted into applause, champagne glasses raised. I didn't lift mine. I wasn't there to toast. I was there to watch. Because the thing about being invisible, it makes you the perfect witness. And in that moment, the performance began. Ethan stepped forward to the mic, all charm and polish, like he'd just walked off the set of a political drama. His suit was crisp, jawline-tight voice tuned to the right frequency of confident and humble. "I wanted to take a moment," he said, "to share something I haven't really talked about publicly. It's personal." The room leaned in. Even the waitstaff paused. "I was part of a military advisory project 2 years ago," Ethan began. "Highly sensitive, covert, actually. I can't give all the details, but let's just say we had to make a call in a situation where hundreds of civilian lives were on the line. There was no playbook, no second chances." He took a measured breath. I remember the code name like it was tattooed on my brain, Operation Eagle Drop. My stomach clenched. He kept going. It was a high-altitude tactical sweep in a hostile zone. No air support, minimal ground intel. We had to reroute a civilian convoy under enemy pursuit, while simultaneously extracting assets behind enemy lines. Timing was everything. One wrong call, and we'd have lost them all. People gasped softly. My father beamed. "I wasn't alone, of course," Ethan added, "but I helped design the plan, briefed the team. I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, monitoring satellite feeds and communicating with ground units. In the end, we pulled it off." Applause. The kind that rises slowly and sincerely, like people were witnessing something noble. But I wasn't clapping. I wasn't even breathing. Because I had lived Operation Eagle Drop, I had named it. Eagle Drop was a phrase I scribbled in my mission notebook at 3:47 a.m. on the second night of that operation, after watching a surveillance drone capture the silhouette of 2 refugee children hiding under a wrecked livestock trailer. I'd said aloud, "We're dropping in like eagles, sharp and fast." And the name stuck. No one else even liked it. But I made it stick. I briefed on that mission. I coordinated it. I was the one awake at 4 a.m. when the evac team got pinned down and the comms dropped. Ethan wasn't there. He wasn't even read into the clearance level that the operation sat under. The project, he advised. It was a PowerPoint pitch for a simulated war game 4 months later. He probably heard the phrase in a meeting and liked how it sounded. So he took it, dressed it up, told it like it was his, stolen valor wrapped in a tailored speech. I looked across the room. People nodded with admiration. My mother was dabbing her eyes like her son had brought peace to a war-torn country. My father's chest swelled like he had birthed a hero, and there, just behind the curtain of applause, was Emery. His face had paled. His eyes darted once toward me, then down. He knew. I saw it in the way his shoulders hunched, the way his fingers twisted the hem of his shirt. He knew the story wasn't Ethan's. He knew it was mine. But he didn't move, didn't speak, just bowed his head and said nothing. A part of me ached for him, not with anger, but with recognition. I'd lived years as the one who saw the truth, but kept it buried, out of survival, out of not wanting to become the target. Emery wasn't weak. He was just stuck, just like I'd been. Ethan wrapped up his story with the kind of humility that's polished for cameras. It's not about medals or recognition, he said. It's about doing what needs to be done. Quietly. Honourably. He looked straight at me when he said it, and I swear for a second something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, not fear, but arrogance, the kind that grows when you steal someone's story and know they can't tell it back. I took another sip of water. It tasted like metal. After the crowd thinned out, I wandered through the old house like a ghost in my own past. The walls were the same yellowing, floral wallpaper and creaky floorboards, but something felt edited. It wasn't until I passed the bookshelf in the living room that it hit me. The photo. One of me in uniform, first year at Fort Bragg. It used to sit front and centre in the family's shrine to achievement. Right next to Ethan's most likely to lead award and Mum's framed PTA certificates. Now, it was gone. In its place, a new frame gleamed like a crown jewel. Ethan, in his induction uniform, staring out like he'd already saved the world. I stared at the empty space where I remembered mine had been. The dust outline gave it away. Same size. Same frame. Just vanished. I walked into the kitchen, where my mother stood arranging leftover pies like she was trying to pretend nothing was off. "Where's my photo?" I asked, quiet, but direct. She didn't look up. "Which one? You know which one?" "Oh, that. Got dusty," she said, brushing crumbs from her hands. I put it away in a drawer somewhere. A drawer somewhere, like a misfiled bill, like an expired coupon. "Which drawer?" I asked, still calm. She finally looked up. "Does it matter?" "Yes," I didn't say it out loud. But it mattered in the way forgetting someone's birthday does. In the way erasing a chapter from a book and pretending it still makes sense does. That photo had been taken the day before I deployed. I remember standing straight, even though the collar itched the sun too bright on my face. My father had taken it grudgingly. Mum had smoothed my hair like I was still 12. Ethan had run through the frame last minute and photobombed me. I kept the shot anyway. I found the frame later that night buried behind the sink under a pile of appliance manuals and expired warranties. Still in perfect condition. Just hidden. I held it in my hands for a long time, then put it back in the drawer exactly as I'd found it. Let it stay buried, like everything else. As I helped stack chairs and fold up the last of the rented tablecloths Emery walked over. His hands were full of half-deflated balloons, but his face was full of something else. Shame maybe, or quiet apology. "I saw the wall," I said. He swallowed hard. "I didn't move it. I swear, I know." He looked around to make sure no one else was near, then leaned in. "I wish I could say something. I wish I could stand up." His voice cracked on the last word. He was 17, maybe 18 now. Just old enough to know when something's wrong, but still too tied down by the rules of this house to untie his voice. "You did," I said. "You just did." He smiled, weak but real. I saw something in him then. A flicker. Maybe the same one my mother once saw in me when she gave me that name. I sat with him for a moment longer than necessary. Then, almost without thinking, I shared something. A story. Just a short one. There was this mission, once I said. Civilians were trapped. Intel was wrong. We were told there were 10. Turned out there were 26, including a baby. Command said to extract only the primary targets. But I couldn't leave the rest. "What did you do?" Emery whispered. "I broke orders," I said simply. "Bought time. We got them all out." His eyes widened. "That's incredible!" I shook my head. "No, it got me buried, same as that photo." He said nothing, just nodded. And in that silence, I felt the first hint of a new kind of understanding. Not loud, not heroic, but human. And maybe, just maybe that was enough for now. The next morning, the house smelled of burnt coffee and reheated pastries. Leftover crumbs clung to the edges of decorative plate souvenirs from last night's triumph that hadn't belonged to me. I sat on the edge of the sunroom couch, alone watching morning light bleed through lace curtains, trying not to think about how quiet triumph can feel when it doesn't have your name on it. The old television in the corner blinked on. My uncle must have left it on autoplay. CBS morning report. I wasn't listening until I saw it. A red banner cut across the bottom of the screen, like a wound, breaking Noor Callahan, confirmed as youngest general in US military history. The anchor's voice followed with calm precision. CBS has verified that Major General Noor Callahan, aged 34, has been appointed Strategic Director of the newly classified AI Defense Initiative, making her the youngest woman to hold this rank in recorded US history. The footage shifted to me, standing in full dress uniform, saluting before the Pentagon emblem. Ribbons crisp against navy blue. My real self. The self they'd buried. The fork fell from someone's hand in the kitchen. It clattered against the tiled floor and echoed like a gunshot. Then, silence. I turned, slowly like a ghost who had finally made noise. Ethan stood in the doorway, white-knuckling the back of a dining chair. His mouth was slightly open, as if the air had been punched out of him. Behind him, my father froze, mid-pour, the bottle of Merlot tilting just enough to spill red across the white tablecloth. It looked like a wound blooming. My mother was the last to speak. She didn't even look up. Just sipped her tea, expression blank, then said flatly, "They must have mixed her up with someone else. Noor doesn't even come to family functions. How could she be a general?" I didn't answer, not out loud. But something moved in me, quiet and seismic. I watched as Ethan tried to recover, clenching and unclenching his fists, jaw pulsing. Emery stood frozen beside the window, his eyes locked on the screen, barely blinking. I caught his reflection in the glass. He looked proud, but afraid to show it. No one clapped. No one congratulated me. Not even a raised brow of acknowledgement. It was like watching my own life be announced in a language they refused to learn. I stood slow and calm, walked past them all. My father didn't stop me. My mother didn't call my name. I reached the hallway and paused just beside the family photo wall. They're still missing the frame where my first military portrait used to hang. The space was filled with Ethan's graduation picture, gold cords gleaming, smile, empty eyes. I reached forward, gently straightened the tilted frame. "Don't worry," I whispered, not to the photo, but to the space it had stolen. "This one's temporary." And, just like that, the present receded, and I was pulled backward into a smaller house, a smaller body, a smaller voice. I was 9, standing on the front porch in a navy blue dress, 2 sizes too big, trying not to cry. The local church choir had just finished its winter recital. My solo had cracked halfway through the 3rd line. A wrong note, a breath too early, a silence that lasted too long. The audience still clapped. Parents smiled with polite encouragement. But when we got back home, my father didn't say a word. Not at first, just yanked his belt from around his waist with a slow, deliberate snap. Not to hit me, but to lay it on the table beside the car keys. A message. His voice was colder than the snow still clinging to my boots. "You humiliated us," he said. "A Callahan should never stand in the spotlight if they're not prepared to earn it." "I tried," I whispered, eyes stinging. "Trying isn't enough. Not in this house." That night, I sat at the edge of my bed, fingers tracing the hem of my dress, wondering what it would take to be worth something. Not tolerated, not corrected, but seen. I remember how my mother didn't come upstairs. No one did. I fell asleep still wearing the dress, the sleeves itchy, the collar too tight. That was the year I stopped singing. I stopped raising my hand in class. I stopped asking to be seen. Over time, my world shrank to yes or no answers and avoidance. I learned the math of invisibility. The less space you take, the less they can strike. My brother Ethan especially thrived in the opposite. Loud achievements, loud opinions, loud footsteps in the hall. He soaked up all the pride in the house and still wanted more. I remember the Christmas I turned 12. Ethan got a new guitar. I got a set of highlighters. For your notes, my mother said, as if highlighting mediocrity could turn it golden. By 16, I was spending most weekends volunteering at the local VFW centre. No one knew. I never mentioned it. I liked the quiet the old veterans who called me kid and let me listen to their stories without needing to perform. That's where I first heard about enlisting. Not from a recruiter, but from a woman named Lila, who had served in Desert Storm. She spoke of duty like it wasn't about obedience, but about belonging. About finding your place in a machine built for something bigger than just applause. I was 17 when I made the decision. My father had spent the night bragging about Ethan's latest achievement, a congressional internship. I'd come home that day with a commendation from my school's ROTC program. I set it quietly beside his dinner plate. He never looked down. That night, I sat on my bed and wrote my name on an enlistment form. There was a peace to it, like stepping into your own shadow and finding out it's warmer than the spotlight ever was. When I told them, my father laughed, in what the marching band I held out the form, signed, stamped, sealed. His face drained. "This isn't a joke, no, sir." He pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped tile. A Callahan doesn't take orders from people who couldn't pass geometry. My mother said nothing, just moved peas around her plate. That night, I packed everything I owned into a duffel bag, 1 hoodie, 3 notebooks, my old choir medal, and a copy of Ender's Game. I left before sunrise. The only light in the house came from the porch lamp Emery left on. I don't know if he knew I'd be leaving that night, but I like to think he did. He'd slipped a folded note under my door. "I don't know why you have to go, but I think it's brave." I wasn't brave. Not then. Just done. Done with the hollow dinners, the rooms that only echoed with other people's names. I walked 2 miles to the bus station, heart pounding, fingers numb. As the bus pulled away, I looked back once. No faces in the window, no goodbyes. What I didn't know until years later was that after I left, my father removed my name from the family genealogy tree he kept on the dining room wall. Where Noor Callahan had once been there was a blank space. Just white paper. Just silence. But silence, I would learn, is not the absence of sound. It's the prelude to something louder than words. That lesson came in fragments. Encrypted emails, secure channels, names that appeared too often in the wrong places. After the ceremony, after the broadcast, after the stunned hush that lingered in my family's house like smoke from a fire no one would admit had burned, I stayed. Not for them, but for me. Something wasn't done. Something deeper than the insult of erasure. Emery found me in the attic the next day, kneeling beside an old box of yearbooks and unused candles. "You shouldn't go back alone," he said. I didn't answer. He hesitated, then added, "There's something I think you should see." It was a forwarded email chain he had stumbled across it on the shared family desktop, accidentally left open by his father. The subject line regarding Operation WL exposure risk. One name caught my breath mid-read. Ethan. Attached was a memo drafted by an official at the State Strategic Office, someone I'd worked with briefly in simulation review. The memo outlined a concern Ethan Callahan had submitted a concept briefing, too similar to a real operation, that was still sealed under top secret protocol. Possibility of information leak through family connection, further inquiry recommended. Emery looked at me. They were watching him. They should have been watching you, I said quietly. But he used your mission like a resume bullet. Nor they knew. He sat beside me, voice tight. There's more. Emery showed me a login timestamp from a secure server. Someone using a guest clearance had accessed unlisted data tags related to Operation Winterlight 3 months ago. I felt the air change in the room. I remembered a phone call I'd gotten weeks prior, a veteran appreciation interview that turned out to be nothing but vague questions about unit deployment patterns. It hadn't felt right. Now I knew why. Ethan hadn't just taken my story. He'd gone digging for pieces of it to justify his lie, to prep the perfect speech, to make sure that when he told the world my story, it didn't sound like mine anymore. He didn't want my light. He wanted my silence. I stood blood thick with a kind of quiet rage that didn't ask for drama, it asked for truth. We need to log this, I said. Emery hesitated. You'll have to go through someone official. I know someone, I said. Marcus Lee, my former teammate and now cyber operations analyst at the DoD, owed me a favour. I called him from the guest room using an encrypted line. I didn't say much, just enough to light the fuse. He didn't ask questions. He never did. Send me the files, Marcus said. I'll check metadata and trace back anything he pulled. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the garden with a mug of black coffee, watching dawn slide across the lawn like a second chance. The house was still. Too still. Inside, they were pretending the world hadn't shifted. My mother made pancakes. My father ironed the Sunday paper. Ethan left early for a conference call. But Emery and I knew. The silence wasn't ignorance anymore. It was denial. The kind of denial that festers into rot. Later that afternoon, Marcus called back. I ran the headers. Their access came from a guest account tied to a third-party political advisory firm. Guess who's on their payroll, Ethan, I said. He wasn't just telling your story. He was packaging it for campaign credibility, positioning himself as a future congressman. My stomach twisted. How deep? Deep enough to make it a problem, Marcus replied, but not deep enough that we can't fix it. I stared out the window. Then, let's fix it. But there was one more thing, one more echo buried in the silence. Emery found it, while checking a flash drive his father had tucked into a tax file, a document draft. A speech Ethan had written months ago for a Veterans Unity Gala, the exact story of Operation Eagle Drop, word for word. Dated before the party, before the broadcast, before the news broke. He was going to tell it anyway, Emery whispered, even if you never showed up. That hit harder than the lie itself. Ethan didn't tell my story out of spite. He told me because he never thought I'd return, because he believed my absence would be permanent, because he trusted the silence. But silence, I'd learned, is not absence. It's a waiting room for truth. And mine was knocking, loudly. The fire didn't roar, it whispered like it had something to confess. Smoke curled along the beams, like fingers reaching for truth. It started in the northeast wing near the storage shed that held old tax documents and an entire lifetime of family secrets. By the time I saw the glow from my bedroom window, it was already breathing fast. I bolted down the hall, barefoot skidding past photos that had never included me. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp, bitter scent of burning wood and varnish. Someone screamed my aunt, maybe. Then the glass shattered, and I didn't wait to identify the voice. I sprinted toward the source. Mum was in the kitchen coughing, one hand clutched to her chest, eyes wild. She wasn't moving fast enough. "Mum!" I shouted. She looked up like she'd seen a ghost. I didn't stop to explain. I grabbed her arm, slung it over my shoulder, and hauled her through the hallway. Smoke followed us fast and eager, licking at the curtains, swallowing corners of the house like a starving mouth. Behind us, someone yelled for water. Someone else called 911. But in that moment, it was just her and me. We stumbled out into the night air, collapsing onto the lawn. Mum gasped, hair dishevelled, blouse scorched at the hem. She tried to speak, but I pressed a hand to her shoulder. "Save it," I said. "Breathe." Emery was already there, pale-faced, frozen. His hands trembled, phone clutched like a lifeline. "You okay?" he asked, voice cracking. "I'm fine," I said, eyes still locked on the flames. "She's okay too." He swallowed, then leaned closer. It wasn't the wiring. That fire, it started too fast. Too clean. I turned sharply. "What are you saying?" Emery's voice dropped. "I think someone started it." My first instinct was to deny it, to blame faulty lines or an old heater. But I knew that part of the house, it had no power sources, no flammables nearby, and it burned like it had been waiting for someone to strike a match. Later that night, after the fire trucks came and my mother was resting, I sat beside Emery in the stillness of his room. We spoke in low tones, cautious. The kind of whispering you do when the house itself feels like it's listening. "I saw something weird," he said. Yesterday morning, Ethan was on Dad's computer. Thought he was checking emails, but when I walked in, he closed a window real quick. I caught one word before it disappeared. What word? Coordinates. My blood went cold. That night, I texted Marcus. Marcus Tran had been my unit's intel lead during our last deployment. Smart, suspicious, paranoid in the way only good analysts are. He owed me a favour. "I need to know if a civilian accessed restricted location data tied to my family's property," I wrote. He responded 2 minutes later. "Send me the IP. And, Noor, what are you walking into?" I didn't answer that part, because I wasn't sure yet. All I knew was the security footage of the estate. Every camera in the northeast wing had gone dark 15 minutes before the fire started. A coincidence? Marcus didn't think so. 2 hours later, I had an email with metadata traces, screenshots, and a name. Ethan. He had logged into a third-party server through a masked IP routed out of DC, accessed archived blueprints of the estate, and pulled GPS logs marked EMR CB FWD emergency contact backups for family members. The last ping, the exact corner of the house that had caught fire. I stared at the screen for a long time, stomach twisting. "Why?" I whispered. Emery hovered behind me, reading over my shoulder. "You don't think he wanted to? I don't know what I think," I cut in. "But if this was to silence someone, it didn't work." He was quiet for a long time. "Then why didn't you let the fire take her? Because that wasn't who I was. Because even if she'd erased me from the wall, from the narrative, from the bloodline, she was still my mother." "I wasn't raised by her," I said softly. "I was raised by absence, and absence taught me mercy." Outside, the house still steamed. Ash clung to the windows, like regret. I knew the next steps now. Ethan had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and for the first time, Emery saw it too. He looked up at me, jaw set. "Whatever you're going to do next, don't do it alone." I placed a hand on his shoulder. I never did, because truth, like fire, needs air. And now, there was finally enough oxygen to burn. The next morning, I walked into the parlour where Ethan sat alone scrolling through news updates, no doubt looking for traces of himself. His posture was tense chin, raised just enough to mimic control. I stood in the doorway watching the performance unravel. "We need to talk," I said. He didn't turn. "About the fire, about the lies. The story you sold. The one you set on fire, literally." He finally looked up, and for a moment there was something almost human in his eyes. Not guilt, not fear, just exhaustion. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "Try me." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "All my life, they compared me to people who weren't even in the room. But you," he laughed bitter and low, "you weren't in the room, and you still eclipsed me. You left, disappeared, and still managed to become the sun they orbit around. I just wanted one moment, one room that clapped for me. I shook my head slowly. So you stole mine? I adapted, he replied, like that made it less of a theft. I filled a void. No, I said. You created one. He stood suddenly, energized eyes blazing. You think I haven't paid for it? Every night since the news broke, I've waited for a call, a knock, someone saying it's over, that I'm done. But they never came. And you know why I stared. Because they don't care who really saved anyone. They just want someone who looks like a hero. That stopped me. Not because it was false, but because it was partially true. The system didn't just reward valor, it rewarded the image of valor, the performance of patriotism. You want me to pity you? I asked. You played the system and got caught. But here's the thing. Ethan, this wasn't just about a stolen story. You endangered lives. You endangered Emery. And for what legacy? He didn't answer. I stepped closer. You're not a villain. You're not even a mastermind. You're a scared boy in a grown man's suit, desperate for applause that was never meant for you. Then, why'd you come back? He asked suddenly softer. Why not let me have it? You were already gone. Because I earned it, I whispered, and because the truth matters, even when no one claps for it. Silence stretched between us. I didn't expect remorse. I didn't even want it. I wanted accountability, and I was done asking for it. I left him there, surrounded by his curated trophies, his edited legacy, his self-made cage. That afternoon, I met with a military ethics panel. The CBS broadcast had triggered a wider investigation. There were emails, metadata, and a timeline too precise to ignore. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked them in the eye and said, no. I want the truth made public. Let the story do what justice can't. Emery posted the full email chain that evening, along with my original mission briefing, redacted but real. His caption read, "For the woman who taught me, silence is not safety. For the story they tried to bury. The soldier they hid from us, it exploded." Veterans chimed in. Journalists reshared it. Young girls in ROTC tagged each other in the comments saying, This is why we stay." Ethan's name trended for a few hours, but not in celebration. It trended under headlines like false valor and family betrayal. But I didn't smile. I just breathed. I wasn't back to punish. I was back to correct the record. That night, I sat in the garden again. Emery joined me, quiet as usual, but his posture had changed, less hunched, more open. "You really going to speak at the ethics summit?" he asked. "They invited me," I said. "Figured I should say something while people are listening." He nodded. "I'm glad you're not invisible anymore." I looked at him. "I never was. You saw me. That was enough." He looked down, a small smile on his face. "Still, it's different now." And he was right. Something had shifted. Not in them, but in me. I wasn't asking to be seen anymore. I was shining on my own terms. Not because they gave me space, but because I stopped waiting for permission. The invitation came 2 weeks later. Not from family, not from the local paper, but from Admiral Thompson, a decorated retired naval officer who had watched Emery's post and CBS's documentary. The email was succinct. "We need your voice at the National Military Ethics Summit." It wasn't phrased as a request, it was a summons. The summit hall was a cathedral of purpose. Oak-panelled walls echoed with heritage, rows of seats filled with men and women in uniform, their ribbons and insignia a mosaic of service and sacrifice. Civilian experts and journalists completed the audience, each person a stakeholder in the story of honour, truth and leadership. I stepped out of the wings, wearing simple business attire, no medals, no fanfare, just a presence earned by action. I paused, backstage, heart-pounding, palms damp. I tucked that nervousness away and stepped forward, lifted my gaze and touched the podium with both hands. I unfolded my speech and felt their eyes before I even began. Silence filled the room as I cleared my throat. "My name is Noor Callahan," I said, voice steady. "I'm 34 years old and I serve as Strategic Director for the Department of Defense's AI Defense Initiative. I'm here not to speak of medals or power, but of responsibility and what it means to be missing in plain sight." I paused. A gentle exhale. Then I told them about Operation Winter Light, the mission no one knew I led. I described wormholes in intel, the weight of decisions made in dark computer rooms, and the lives saved women, children, elders on the other side of the world. I spoke of ethical lines drawn in sand and the burden of decisions that never make lounge conversations, but determine who lives and who dies. Then I shifted tone. But this isn't just about remote theatres of war. It's about what happens when truth is hidden, or worse, borrowed. It's about the cost of silence and the price of stolen valor. My cousin Ethan presented my story as his own. He spoke on stages meant for me, referenced operations he never led, and he nearly let us all believe it. Heads nodded. Journalists scribbled notes. A sense of collective realization perfused the room. I continued softer now. What hurt more than the theft wasn't so much the lie, it was the system that allowed it, the family that applauded it, the silence that made it possible. For almost a decade, I was written out by omission, by casual erasure. But whose responsibility is it to correct that? Ours. All of ours. I introduced Emery, my cousin, no longer the silent kid who left me a note, but a young adult who had risked family layers to post the email chain. I commended his courage. I asked the audience, who here will be his voice? Who will risk comfort to speak the truth? Who will insist on accountability, even when it's easier to remain silent? At that moment, applause began, hesitant at first, then surging. It wasn't spectacle, it was solidarity. When I looked up, eyes glistened the retired colonel who'd served 2 tours, a young lieutenant in digital security, a civilian veteran advocate taking notes. I realized the echo I had become was more than a family injustice. It was a movement. Backstage, I was greeted by a journalist from a major network pressing her phone recorder. "Noor, that was powerful." "What's next?" I told her I'm forming a coalition for ethical storytelling in military narratives. No silence, no theft, just accountability. That evening, as I scrolled through coverage, I saw headlines like, "Noor Callahan, the light, they tried to bury, and from silence to summit. A soldier's stand for truth." CBS's segment rolled again, this time online. I watched the footage of my speech, the audience rising Emery's face behind me, hopeful and proud. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Former teammates sent voice memos, "Still got your 6. Other veterans wrote, "We stand with you." A few distant cousins texted from branches of the family tree that hadn't vanished, saying, "We're sorry." I didn't respond. Not yet. Late that night, I slipped outside to the terrace. The city light stretched before me, bleachers of distant victories, private battles, second chances. I texted Emery, they heard, "You permitted them to listen." His reply came quickly. "They weren't the only ones. You gave me mine." I sat in the quiet and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Fullness. Not of acclaim, but of purpose. For once, living out of the spotlight didn't feel like disappearing. It felt like choosing light. And I realized my legacy wouldn't be a medal case or a framed photograph. It would be the echo of one soldier's choice to speak truth into silence. It would be the responsibility I carried now to shine, to witness, and to hold others to that light. But light doesn't always mean legacy written in stone or titles etched onto office doors. When the Pentagon offered me the elevated post, Strategic Director of Long-Term Global Engagement, I hesitated. Not because I doubted my ability, but because I'd begun to see something deeper, the power of shaping not missions but minds, of guarding not just borders but values. I turned it down 3 days later. The Admiral's voice on the other end of the call didn't mask her surprise. "Is it the pressure?" she asked. "No," I said. "It's the purpose." And for once, no further explanation was needed. Instead, I channeled every briefing, every lesson scarred into my back and soul into something new, a centre. Not a think tank, not a war room. A place called the NOR Initiative. Its mission was clear: to train the next generation of defence strategists, not just in warfare, but in ethics, story ownership, and moral command. We leased an old schoolhouse outside Arlington, repainted the walls with soft neutrals, filled the halls with quotes not from generals, but from those history tends to footnote. One wall read in black calligraphy, "Do not inherit power without first learning mercy." Students came from ROTC programs, cyber divisions, and even civilian conflict mediators. They didn't come to win wars, they came to prevent them. And every single one of them had read Emery's post. I made sure of that. On the second week of opening a delivery came an oversized canvas wrapped in brown paper. No return label. Just one note in soft graphite. For the wall where they tried to erase you. I opened it carefully. It was a portrait, charcoal and watercolour. I sat, no uniform, gaze steady. In the background, outlines of people young blurred at the edges as if in motion. And beneath it, scrawled in gold, she wore no cape but carried us all. Jamie, the daughter of a medic I'd once shielded during a strike on a base hospital. She had been 12 then. I hadn't heard from her since. I hung the painting in the main hall right above the registration desk. Students often paused there staring longer than they meant to. A few asked who painted it. I never told them. I wanted them to feel the message, not trace it back to a name. The weeks turned to months. Classes began to deepen, and slowly stories from the students surfaced of nearly dropped missions, of overlooked trauma, of the kind of leadership that forgets its roots. We taught them not just to write reports, but to ask, whose voice is missing here? What silence are we not listening to? One afternoon, Emery arrived early for a guest seminar. He'd grown into his voice now, working with veterans advocacy groups, developing a podcast on intergenerational silence and healing. We sat in my office as he sipped green tea and watched the rain streak the windows. "Do you think it's working?" he asked. "The centre, the stories." I turned from my desk, looked him full in the face. "We won't know for years. But even if one of them walks into a boardroom or briefing and pauses, just pauses before repeating history, then yes, it's working." He nodded slowly, then glanced around the room. "Do you ever miss it? The fight?" "I never left it," I said. "I just changed the weapon." That night, as we locked up, he lingered by the painting. Rain had stopped, and the air outside smelled like wet earth and new beginnings. I stepped beside him, arms crossed, the soft clack of my boots echoing through the empty hall. "You know, I said they once told me light disappears when no one sees it." And Emery asked. I smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the window, where dusk bled into evening. "They were wrong. Light can set, but it never disappears." He looked at me, then not with the awe of someone who'd watched a phoenix rise, but with the calm respect of someone who'd helped build the fire. "Say it again," he said. I did, slowly this time. Light can set, but it never disappears. And in that moment, with the windows aglow, the portrait standing sentinel, and the hum of tomorrow already echoing down the hallway, I knew the legacy I left behind wouldn't be burned into marble or shouted from podiums. It would live in pauses, in changed minds. In this way, silence once broken became a bridge. I turned the lights off one by one, leaving only the portrait illuminated in the quiet. And we walked out together into a night that no longer frightened me, because I had become what they never expected: Not just the echo, but the origin. Not just the story, but the light itself. And if you're still listening, if somewhere in your life you've ever felt erased, overlooked, or dimmed by someone else's spotlight, hear me when I say this. You were never invisible. You were preparing. Light doesn't need permission to rise, and neither do you. If this story found you in a quiet moment, maybe it's because part of you needed to remember you don't have to shout to matter. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that simply stays. I'd love to hear your story too. Drop it in the comments, or just say, I'm still here, because sometimes that's the bravest thing we can say. And if you'd like to stay close to stories like this, stories of quiet strength of truth, reclaiming its place, hit that subscribe button. We're building something honest here, something that listens back. You're not alone. Not anymore.